Montreal. Here at Force we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things in development here across the university. And we're running this event today as a live stream meeting. So we welcome any comments or questions via the chat if you're joining by Zoom. And for those of you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know and we'll raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. With that, it's very much my pleasure to hand this over to the organizer of the South Asia Speaker Series and Assistant Professor in Religions and Cultures, Dr. Saparnika Balaswaminathan. Saparnika, welcome.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome again, everyone, to the Southern Asia Studies Speaker Series. This is a series of 6 talks that have been organized for the year. This is the 5th of the 6 talks. Those of you who've been coming for all these talks, it's really nice to see you again, and thank you so much for coming. And those who are here for the first time, welcome. I hope to be able to see you for the last talk that we will have scheduled in March. So these talks were conceived as a way to build networks across departments, universities, as well as regions. And today's talk features research that centers the climate politics of South Asia. This will be Professor Farhana Sultana from Syracuse University, who is an esteemed scholar of the subject, and we are very, very thankful for her for joining us, and we look forward to the talk. We have 2 graduate students from the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia who will be moderating the talk and introducing Professor Sultana. So I'm passing on the mic to these young scholars, Sri Lakshmi Ramachandran and Pramila Chowdhury.
Hello. Thank you, Shubhanika. I'm going to introduce Dr. Farhana. Thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Farhana Sultana is internationally recognized and award-winning interdisciplinary scholar, speaker, and author. She's broadly interested in nature-society relationships, political ecology, climate justice, water governance, critical development studies, transnational feminist theories, critical urban studies, human rights, citizenship, decolonizing in South Asia. It's a long list, and we're really privileged to have you here. Dr. Farhana is a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University, where she's also the research director for environmental and collaboration and conflicts at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflicts and Collaboration. It's called PARC. Prior to joining Syracuse, she taught at King's College London and worked at UNDP, United Nations Development Programs. We welcome you, Dr. Farhana. Over to you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hello and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are, or good evening. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the generous introduction. Saparnika, Sri Lakshmi, and I guess Pramila will come online in a little bit. But I just also want to extend a thank you to everyone who's been involved in making this Zoom talk, a hybrid talk, possible at Concordia University today, and it's a pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share some slides just because I want to show some images to go with the narrative, so it makes sense, and I'm happy to discuss them in greater detail in the Q&A. So hopefully everyone can see this because we did trial it before. If you can't, please do let me know. So today what I'm going to be doing is sharing insights from my research projects on urban climate justice, and also merging it or drawing from some of my prior work and ongoing work on water security. And because global interests in climate justice have exploded on the scene in recent years, I'm going to bring in some of the international and intersectional perspectives of that via a case study of a megacity in the global south, particularly in South Asia, but the parallels can be drawn to many other cities. So what I want to articulate is something that I've said for many years, is that, climate change is effectively water change. It's about too much water, too little water, wrong time, wrong place, wrong quality. So, too much flooding, too little drought, wrong time, wrong time of precipitation, or a disaster, wrong place, and so on and so forth. So that intricate linkage between climate and water and society is the nexus within which my work is located. And in this particular work, I'm looking at a megacities and monsoonal deltas that face climate-related water crises in multitudinal ways. But first, let me talk about, why is this important? For those who don't have much of a background, just a very brief primer. So this might be useful, I hope. So when we talk about climate change in the US, it's much more recent, but the impacts have been felt quite significantly for many decades in developing countries, largely situated in tropical and subtropical regions, as you can see in the map where the dark red is. And these countries have been not only struggling with these variegated climate-related impacts, but they also happen to be post-colonial countries and therefore historically have been oppressed and impoverished in different ways. And as a result of these ongoing histories of colonialism or coloniality, but also geopolitics, we see this kind of cauldron of different forms of issues that come together. And nonetheless, these are the countries that contributed the least amount of climate pollutions or greenhouse gas emissions, which have accumulated in the atmosphere, but bear the brunt of climate breakdown. So it's this kind of double whammy that's happening with more stronger storms, destroying lives, property, and livelihoods, with creeping sea level rise, causing coastal erosion, land level loss, but also saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers, flooding that lasts longer or is more unpredictable, but then also changes in precipitation patterns that make agricultural production more challenging, especially since these are still largely agrarian economies. And then other issues such as heat stress, the impacts of wildfires, desertification, and drought. And again, these are all water-related events. So what we've seen from decades of research is that climate injustices occur in different ways, but they also combine with local planning to adapt to climate change, and then how people cope and adapt to climate impacts. So that's where I'm targeting my research for a long, long time. And I'm interested in, where is this happening? Who are the people, and what resources and power do they have, and so on? What are those injustices and that interplay with human nature and nature-society relationships and human environment dynamics? So when we think about climate adaptation as a key component to surviving climate breakdown, we also therefore need to think of the flip side as climate mitigation in reducing fossil fuel dependency as a important part of what we know as climate breakdown. So this then gives rise to climate justice concerns, which again, I've written extensively about, and it's become a rallying cry across the world. And climate justice looks at both adaptation and climate mitigation, and also loss and damages. I will not focus on that, although I have done research on that and given many talks. What I want to do today is just to set this context, right? That in terms of what happens when we focus down, when we hone in more on climate injustices in specific countries and cities, apart from the global scale, knowing that they are situated within these global relations and historical patterns. But then what do we mean when we also combine international development in the mix? So in this particular case study, I want to look at local understandings of climate injustices and water security to better help explain in more nuanced ways how we can understand climate change impacts via water. And the overarching goal of this research has been to more critically understand not just climate justice, but urban climate justice and planning challenges in megacities in the developing world, how to think about climate adaptation more comprehensively and internationally, and the urgent need to recognize the intersectional climate injustices in more complex ways. And I will be drawing from one particular city in this study in order to highlight in broad brushstrokes what climate adaptation could mean on the ground and how people's perceptions of, attitudes towards, and lived experiences of climate adaptation, flooding, and drinking water access end up varying and complicating any simplistic narrative that we may hold about climate justice. So we need to look at the politics of climate adaptation instead of assuming that all and any climate adaptation is inherently equitable or just. So this case study comes from Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is part of the South Asian context. And as I'm zooming in, I want to again highlight that this is, Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. It sits in a very, very active delta. As you saw, as we zoomed in, we went from the Himalayan foothills down to the Bay of Bengal. And as the city is urbanizing, as you saw, the green areas becoming more brown or rusted over time, what we can understand is to situate this in that wider hydrogeographical and socio-ecological context means that this is a place that has made the news for many, many decades for being a place that has faced many decades or centuries of very precarious environmental and water issues, but more recent decades has been identified as one of the countries more vulnerable to climate change because not only is it an active delta, but it sits in between two of the largest rivers in the world, and it is also incredibly flat. Most of the country is at sea level. So these overlapping social and ecological challenges means that the country as a whole, Bangladesh, which again, historically was part of historic India until 1947, and then part of East Pakistan until it became an independent nation state in 1971. It has historically been one of the most densely populated places on Earth. It is one of those ancient civilizations. It is also a tropical monsoonal climate with heavy rainfall seasonally, heavy agrarian economies, and again, like I said, large delta system, which means many, many canals and creeks and rivers and so on. Now, Dhaka as a capital city sits in between those two large rivers, and it is a rapidly growing megacity that not only is fed by the major Himalayan rivers of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, but then also in terms of being in a delta climate, that means that it faces various forms of natural hazards, not only from being flat and being in a flood plain, but from being flood prone. And a city that has grown from its ancient times from like a village into a city, into a port city, to be much more active in the colonial centuries, and then into the national capital of a largely thriving and expanding nation state. So the water-related hazards end up combining with human interventions into the landscape or the waterscape. And there are histories that create these uneven terrains of disasters and injustices. The overlapping water and climate injustices are heightened in cities like Dhaka, where there's also a lack of urban planning. And social inequities and development interventions collide with global climate change to produce various injustices and vulnerabilities. So to do a thorough climate injustice analysis, I have to understand both global processes, from climatic and atmospheric changes to national climate budgeting issues, all the way down to local issues, such as urban planning and local social inequities. And this scalar analysis is critically important to me as a geographer who looks at that interface between nature and society. So I'm going to basically focus on the decision-making processes at different scales, local, national, and international in the wider study to lend evidence. But what I want to do right now is to just talk you through what it means to think about climate injustices in any megacity where the local context matters. And just some quick examples of what this means. So like many rapidly growing megacities around the world, Dhaka is a city of contrasts. It is a megacity in the sense that it is rapidly urbanizing and it is quite large. There are more than 20 million people in a very densely populated space that was once crisscrossed by rivers, canals, and lakes, but is increasingly a concretized jungle. There are high rises with affluent residents, with, rooftop swimming pools and so on. But then there are also large numbers of lower income communities dispersed throughout the city who live in informal settlements or often unhoused, but they often live in spaces of informality, and the term slums continue to be used, although I do recognize the long history of the problematic usage of that term. But it is the term that is locally often mobilized. So what we're still seeing is not only discursively in how spaces get labeled, but the materiality of the haves and the have-nots. The haves live in secure housing with access to urban infrastructure like water and drainage systems, but the have-nots, which is a third of that 20+ million population, live in informal settlements with insecure and inadequate housing and lack public infrastructure and safety nets, but that's because they have no tenure rights to the land on which they live. And these heterogeneities enable various climate injustices via water and urban politics to become possible. So just like there is climate apartheid at a global scale, where wealthy countries like the US face less and delayed impacts of climate breakdown compared to tropical developing post-colonial nation states, that analytic can be applied to the city scale. But I also think hydroapartheid applies here, and I combine those as I'll explain in a little bit. So what we see in Dhaka is flooding from monsoon rains, as well as inadequate urban infrastructure and lack of coordinated planning, causing severe waterlogging, where rainwater overwhelms the drainage systems and poses severe problems for city inhabitants on a regular basis. The water simply cannot drain out fast enough. As climate change alters hydrosocial cycles, this climate apartheid is being observed, where the elite can navigate and appropriate the city very differently than others, thereby alienating, marginalizing, and essentially drowning out up to a third of the city's population. However, at the same time, rising temperatures cause heat stress that disproportionately affect the city's poor population, who lack ventilated housing, forget air conditioning, but live largely in corrugated metal tin huts in marginal spaces. And therefore, they cook like in pressure cookers in boiling heat of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity. Compound this with inadequate access to proper drinking water supply, sanitation networks, and sewage facilities, and you've got cauldrons of various waterborne diseases and heat stroke. So a third of the city's population lives in such spaces, and they're also poorer members of the community. They're often factory workers, rickshaw pullers, maids, shopkeepers, cleaners, and beggars. And they lack that economic and political power to challenge the way the city is rapidly expanding. And while these informal spaces or even organized communities absorb the migrants who are coming to the city for livelihoods, that part of the equation is what gets blamed. Oh, the poor are arriving in the city, rather than how are the wealthy creating crises of lack of drainage or increased concrete, jungle. But what we're seeing is that development interventions throughout the country are also leading to a collision with hydrological and climatic changes. That means that coastal areas facing sea level rise, increased tropical cyclones and storm surges, along with riverbank erosion and failing agrarian economies, lead to more displaced people coming to the capital city to eke out livelihoods. So as the city faces growing challenges with its existing population, as well as absorbing increasing numbers of displaced migrants every day, these migrants are forced to live in the informal settlements, and the city is buckling under the need to provide more for its urban residents. Given all this, the urban spaces of Dhaka are therefore occupied by people with variable vulnerabilities, histories, and threat exposures or risk exposures. So we need to question what climate adaptation means on the ground and how people's perceptions of, attitude towards, and lived experiences of climate change adaptation also vary, not just their experiences of climate itself. So when I look at the politics of climate adaptation, inherently thinking that it is not just or equitable, which is often the common way people approach it, I approach it differently. How is it not equitable or just? Or is it not? Perhaps it is equitable. So we can look at issues around flooding or heat stress, inadequate housing, water insecurity, drainage congestion, lack of sanitation facilities, and so forth, and how they combine in different combinations to create various climate injustices. And this is important to investigate and understand critically in my mind so that we can have better understandings of urban climate injustices in complex ways and have detailed information in order to configure any equity goals that need to be achieved. So when I think about the city, it is literally about that saying, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. But it's also not enough to bathe, clean, and wash hands with. And this spatial inequity is largely mapped out by class. So we talked about like formal, well-built middle and upper middle class or upper class neighborhoods in concrete or brick and cement buildings versus these informal settlements or slums that are usually built on bamboo stilts, that sometimes may be thatched huts or might be a little bit more formal in terms of structural kind of improvement if people can afford metal tins. But we see that this sort of spatialness also is intersected by gender. So whereby the poor women face the double burdens of not only class inequities, but patriarchy. And this is where hydro-apartheid is further compounded. Intersectionality means the overlapping oppressions that people experience, and these axes of social difference generally occur along the intersecting lines of gender, class, race, ability, age, and so on that are the most relevant in a place. In the context of Dhaka and this topic, intersections of class, gender, and migrant status, as well as age and disability, were important signifiers. So what I saw was that, yes, these kinds of inequities existed along various axes of social difference. And globally, gender oppressions tend to be the most common axes because of histories of patriarchy and misogyny that are built in not only in social stratification and behavior, but also in policies and planning processes. So in Dhaka, these gendered intersectional inequities exacerbate those differentiated vulnerabilities. The greater burden of providing water for the home, primarily drinking water, but also water for bathing, cooking, cleaning, and hygiene, falls largely on women and girls because of the gender division of labor that still holds despite claims to modernity. This is because water for the household is still a gendered responsibility around the world when there is no household level water connection, which is clearly the case for most informal settlements. So we're actually seeing poorer women in more precarious employment and health status, and girls who are having to drop out of school, spending considerable amounts of time, physical labor, and emotional labor in fetching water for their families from various public and private sources. And this may be challenging because publicly accessible sources may not be viable, or they may be malfunctioning, or simply inaccessible. They may be in schools, places of religious worship, or public government institutions. But at many places where there's a private vendor or a water business, they end up paying exorbitant amounts of money to pay for their daily drinking water needs from these private sources. So again, we see a different layer of complexity and inequity. So by looking at these kind of axes of oppression in this case, I can tease out what we saw, for instance, in the US in Flint, Michigan, where there were clearly intersections of gender and class. What we saw in Flint, Michigan would not have happened in Manhattan. A water contamination case simply does not exist for long when there's wealth and power. So this brings me to the next point in terms of what I mean by drowned out and left out. So in addition to those drinking water challenges that I just talked about and how those play out socially, but by different groups of people, Flooding is a similar huge problem, which is exacerbated with changes in local South Asian monsoonal cycles, which are also linked to the El Nino. So what we're seeing is changes in hydrological patterns, but like I mentioned, but also with planning issues in terms of water drainage. So when these come together, urban flooding and drainage problems or water logging occurs, and it spills out into any green space, but then also in terms of people's homes. So any land that used to be a water body that used to absorb overflow has largely been concretized, and that inadequate sewerage and draining system in place means the city therefore has to dig up more roads and install larger radius drainage pipes, and then it can also get clogged up with other things like garbage. So each year, what happens is those prolonged and increasingly erratic monsoon rainfalls cause significant flash flooding or rapid arrival of a lot of rain, submerging vast tracts of the entire country, and more homes become flooded. But in this city, that haphazard urban planning collides with these climatic events, and then also hydrological events of the Himalayan glacial melt, more water flow in the rivers such as the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. So these come together to exacerbate the urban climate injustices. So when we have more rising storms, which will increase as Earth's median temperature is increasing, we are going to see more of these kinds of problems. And with rising seas, more rural migrants will be driven to these spaces. But as economic crises occur, whether they're linked to global stressors and shocks, they place the cities and families in all kinds of crisis points. And those existing class injustices or class relations and patriarchal relations in the city means that we have to focus on the politics of climate adaptation and climate justice, instead of assuming it is inherently equitable or just across all social groups in a city. Because we know that climate change will continue to amplify, compound, and create new forms of injustices and stressors, and they're all interlinked. Adaptation planning processes have to be mindful of those uncertainties, but then also local ground realities of unevenness in terms of communities and individuals that can actually be made more vulnerable through adaptation endeavors. And then that will just compound ongoing suffering. So the differential power relations and access to decision-making powers and allocation of resources become very apparent. So for instance, is it about information about impending hazards or abilities to evacuate or having access to recover from shocks, better public transportation system so you're not submerged, and so we see that people are navigating and appropriating the city in different ways, whereas the wealthy can continue to remain somewhat dry in their vehicles, whereas the poor are usually on foot or on bicycles or in rickshaws, usually submerged in contaminated water, because this is where sewage and floodwaters mix. And there's different forms of contamination and illnesses that break out as a result. So any effort to address these issues about drinking water crises that occur when there's more challenges, but then also flooding mobility, means that we need to include more vulnerable groups in decision-making and planning, in policymaking, and greater attention needs to be paid to voices and concerns, instead of just leaving it to the city's elite and urban planners to configure just the only way forward, or trying to emulate another city, which may not be the most appropriate. So what I want to do now is basically pull together, in conclusion, some of the issues that I think are relevant to other cities. So although I'm drawing from this one specific case study that I went through fairly quickly in the interest of time, the general conclusions that I can draw out are largely that, well, yes, megacities are growing in both the global south and the global north, as you can see from the map. And these are sites of ongoing and future climate injustices, because a lot of people live and will continue to live in cities, especially megacities that are rapidly burgeoning. What this means is that the first thing to look at is that these are complex, challenging problems. Climate breakdown is rapidly intensifying globally, but for countries that have been experiencing it for a long time, such as Bangladesh, they have dealt with these impacts, and they've also come up with different strategies of adaptation and survival. But at the same time, we need greater climate awareness and attention to frequencies and intensities of climate-related events. And which means that we need to continue to pay attention to these places, not just because climate injustices are happening in wealthy countries too. So climate injustices in megacities, particularly in the global south, face these complex and challenging problems, and the significant disparities in urban spaces come from inequitable access to resources, uneven distribution of risk, unequal political voice to planning processes and outcomes, but then also a historical legacy of various climatic processes that they did not contribute to. In other words, the root causes of climate oppressions have to be addressed if we want to address climate justice. So this then brings me to a second point in terms of looking at overlapping crises and the contrasts. So the overlapping crises in cities like Dhaka are both historical, from colonial times in terms of their spatial and structural form, the urban form in terms of its inequalities and its the morphology of the city, but then also how the city is organized and managed on a day-to-day basis in post-independent development intervention era, as well as that rapid growth that is not always under the control of the city's planners or bureaucrats, and somewhat of a discoordinated, haphazard planning that goes on in many, many cities of the post-colonial majority world. An urban climate justice perspective ends up, requiring us to investigate how and why different groups of people are facing inequities in different ways. And in this case, for me, it means an intentional process, one that involves carefully analyzing who is being left out or marginalized, both by climate change and hydrological processes themselves, but also any adaptation planning that is taking place in its name, in order to better understand who benefits, who loses out, in what ways, where, and why. So climate justice, or a critical climate justice framework, is an explanatory tool that helps people make better sense of any locality. So third point would be to undertake analysis that is mindful of both scale and societal intersectionality, because we know that climate change is a threat multiplier. It is not a single topic issue, and it cannot be solved that way. It is interlinked across social, economic, political factors. At the same time, no community is homogeneous. So social context of intersectional differences are important to understand. As well, scalar analysis is important to explain why and how those issues occur in that place. But then also spatial, right? In terms of that relationality to rural spaces, to the wider globe. And this is where geographers have done a lot of important and interesting work, because we do bring that social, spatial, and scalar analysis simultaneously to any study. So this lets me then focus more closely at those differential vulnerabilities and exposures to better understand how are they changing? What's compounding it? How are they shifting, or are they resolving over time, and different members of communities and households? And these are important to trace. So how power inequities map out in any place is important to first investigate, understand, and then address. And these issues need to be taken into account quite seriously, because they often get overlooked in policy making to address a bigger issue. And I think we need to also think about that technological solutions are always insufficient. They have a role, but same with just chasing issues around fixing the market. These are not only questions of technology and the market. These are much deeper issues around socioecological injustices. So then the next point I always stress is that to look at the local voices and power relations, because if we understand climate adaptation and climate impacts to be political processes, they involve different power hierarchies and create new vulnerabilities, exposures, and inequities in the process. So it is really important not to depoliticize climate change, which often happens, or only approach it in some techno-managerialistic way, because this is the dominant way it has been done for decades, with top-down planning and powerful people making decisions, often causing various forms of suffering and problems for marginalized and oppressed groups. So paying attention to local voices is really, really important. So what this means is deep listening and careful research. And this is where researchers and students come in, because we need to have not just those expert voices accounted for, but plural voices and lived experiences that need to matter. So local voices, especially those of marginalized groups, of particularly people who are more impoverished, or people who identify as women or are disabled or are new migrants to a city, or however the axes of oppression are more dominantly displayed. These need to first absolutely be addressed, and then we need to dig more deeper, because no one is ever voiceless. They simply remain unheard. And what I mean by the role of the student or the researcher is to do the research, to elevate voices, to decenter ourselves so that we can have these sorts of research projects that are very important, because there's a lot of research going into climate science, into climate tech, but not enough on the social science part. And as a result, it means we need to be able to have the skills and training for deep listening and ethical research engagement, right? And to think about power relations and marginalizations. And this goes into much greater issues around how we train, in academia. And I think these are important issues that I'll be happy to speak about later, but I just wanted to flag this. And then lastly, to think that adaptation is not just a technical or apolitical process, the way it has been approached for a very long time. What this means is to think about climate justice and adaptation in cities, especially megacities in the global south, as being political processes and not apolitical something that is just imposed or externally designed by experts, and especially foreign donors. But that to recognize that top-down climate planning is very dominant, but that, they occur in the context of community planning and situated contextual solutions that exist, but are often not integrated enough or prioritized. So this means that those urban planning or even national level planning to deal with how a city copes or how cities residents advance in more socially just ways means making urban planning much more democratic, understanding local context, inclusive of a range of opinions and issues, and that democratic participation of different groups need to be carefully assessed and not just problematically celebrated, because there can be various forms of exclusion in even seemingly participatory contexts. And these issues matter in every place, whether domestically in the US or internationally, in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And as a result, we need to have that careful, complex analysis to bring forth nuanced understandings, and not just, agree with dominant narratives that may or may not be appropriate in a context, but figure out what makes sense and be as truthful to ground realities as much as possible, so that it does help elevate voices and showcase various complexities to help advance wider understanding and debates around climate injustices, but then also about developmental planning. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to conclude there just to keep to time. And if you'd like to learn more about my work or download any of my publications, videos, or podcasts, op-eds, and so on, feel free to visit my website, which is literally my name, farhanasultana.com. So I'll just end slide sharing now if everyone has gotten the information they needed.
Thank you, Professor, for your time. I'm Srilakshmi, and thanks a lot for your talk. I have also, as a student of geography and planning, been reading your work intersecting with infrastructure studies and gender studies, which is where my PhD work itself is situated. So thank you so much for your scholarship and sharing it here with us today. I think we are open for discussions and questions, and I invite the audience to participate. Pramila and I are here to pass on the mic and moderate or mediate a discussion here.
I'll just jump on real quick to say that anyone on Zoom, I know we have some people on Zoom, if they want to ask a question, you're more than welcome to turn on your microphone or camera also and ask that way. We can hear you in the space, or you can type it in the chat and we'll help get that to the.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for that talk. That was amazing. So my research is on conservation of nature and jurisdictional fragmentation across the land-sea interface. And since Dhaka is a city that is kind of stretches across the land-sea interface, I was just wondering if you've ever taken into consideration the jurisdictional separation between management of terrestrial environments and marine environments, and how that can also be a cause of further injustice or, complicate the issue even more. Because now you don't just have one jurisdiction or system of legal system that you need to negotiate with, but you have two different ones. And then when it comes to marine environments, it's this whole issue of national and international waters and that sort of thing.
Thank you for the question. Hopefully I have unmuted myself. I don't know when I went into mute. So the way I see it is that the city is in a floodplain, and it is not necessarily coastal. So the marine jurisdiction doesn't apply as much to the city. For the city, there is a whole heap of jurisdictional overlaps and contrasts. And what we're seeing is that if this were a coastal city, then yes, more of that marine jurisdictional problems would come into play. What we're seeing actually here is that you have like water development board versus urban versus drinking water supply versus public health management. So you've got different bureaucracies, right? Who have, and then different access to spaces and utilization of space, and whose responsibility is it? So there's often the kind of passing of the buck. It's somebody else's responsibility to address this and not this ministry's or this particular body. But for coastal cities, that marine jurisdiction might become more of an issue, but not particularly for Dhaka. But there are other concerns, other jurisdictional overlaps and contestations that exist in this particular city.
Hello, Doctor. We have two questions in chat. Do you want me to read those? So the first one is from Catherine. She's saying, thank you so much for the brilliant talk. I'm wondering, even if we practice deep listening and include diverse voices, how can we actually create impact with research under the current political climate where neo-fascism and ethno-nationalism are on the rise?
All right. Thank you for the question. So yes, fascism and ethno-nationalism are on the rise, even here in the United States. And what that does is it does pose a challenge in terms of how to incorporate that into planning, especially for planners, policymakers, and bureaucrats. But at the same time, I think academics have almost an obligation to do more of this kind of work if they can navigate those boundaries of power relations and safety in these spaces, because this kind of information needs to exist somewhere, right? They need to exist somewhere. These are the stories that need to be shared and told, and especially for if you're a foreign academic and you have that, relational privilege. And I tell this to my students all the time, that, if you have the opportunity to have certain information made known, both in the country you're working in and outside, as ethically as possible without putting anyone in harm's way, but to show these patterns or make sure these issues get some sort of attention. International pressure can often work in bringing certain things to fruition, or you might influence perhaps the way planners are envisioning something, and if you share their work and they make incremental changes. But I do take your concern that, creating impact by deep listening and including diverse voices, you may not see immediate impact because there might be other challenging or oppositional forces at work. But if we don't keep chipping away and just throw our hands up, then I think that's a worsening situation that could help compound or justify certain kind of fascist decisions. So it's a balancing act. How do you make what you're doing known, because you're trying to write perhaps for different audiences, whether it's academic or policy audience or domestic politicians, and then what are the kinds of constraints each are under. And I think a lot of the times people will write like maybe white papers or a policy brief, but they're targeting a wider audience with the hope that it does filter back in. I've also seen research that is much more direct, that they will publish it in a local paper, but because they're based elsewhere, they will anonymize the community. They will not even mention where it is, but they'll speak in terms of broader brushstrokes, the issues, the phenomenon, the processes at play, rather than specific names or places or any identifying markers. And it is a balancing act because there may be, in many ways, you might inadvertently place your research participants in harm's way. And I think that is the first priority that should be there before the need to have the research be wider known.
Thank you for the answer. Is there anyone from the audience? Yeah, we can take your question. Then we have another one in the chat.
Hi, Professor Sultana. This is Sauparnika. I guess my question is to ask about the flip side of looking at climate adaptability as, not something that is inherently just, especially in relation to thinking about, the current macro institutions being neo-fascist and ethno-nationalist, which is that sometimes these bureaucratic solutions that come from these ethno-nationalist and neo-fascist organizations tend to resolve problems. They do tend to have these, technical solutions that have, a positive impact on some of these issues. So I guess the question there is, what is the ethical, position of the scholar over there, especially for scholars who are, applied scholars and are working with government and bureaucratic systems? What do you take this pragmatic approach of let's just make sure that things get done so that, we can have an impact? Or do you want to hold out this, kind of ideological position, this purity that's kind of become more necessary, at least in online discourse, as far as I can see? And of course, I'm putting this out as this polarization that, doesn't actually exist on the ground. But just as a question, I thought I'd phrase it that way, but I was curious about your experiences with working at this intersection of like scholarship and, on the grounds bureaucracy.
Okay, thanks for that. So if I understood the question, I don't particularly work in severely ethno-nationalistic and fascist contexts. There's always, underlying simmering tensions, and there is a rise of fascism where I do work, but at the same time, I think if I understood your question, that if these situations or institutions do provide that meet the needs, then yes, they have met their developmental goals. I suppose they've met various societal necessities. For instance, maybe they're providing water or food or education. And I think this is that balancing act, right? Like who are we to judge and assess what people want in a local context? Because where is that ideology coming from? And even in the US, and in the so-called democracy, I don't think US should ever utter the word human rights anymore. I don't think it has the least bit of concept of what human rights and international law means right now, right? But we'll still hear it, and there'll still be a lot of propaganda around it. But in terms of what is happening for applied scholars on the ground, and that if I understood your question correctly, please do tell me if I got it wrong, because that seemed to be a two-parted question. More the applied scholarship in terms of what they're saying. You mean producing the research for people on the ground, or for the institutions?
I guess it is a two-parter. In one sense, I guess, how do applied anthropologists work with these systems? Right? Like, what is the pragmatics of the pragmatics and the ethics of working within these systems? And the second thing, how do you represent this in your scholarship when you're writing about it?
Okay. So I think navigating these systems is going to be tricky. It's going to be complex. And for applied scholars, they really do need to think about how are they in any way risking their own safety and the safety of the folks they're researching with. I think that's a really important issue. But at the same time, also recognizing that are there ways that maybe they can help bring some things to light. So for instance, could they write about it, write about the process or phenomenon? At the same time, it depends on which audience. Are they writing for the local context, or they're writing for the academic audience? For the academic audience, it gets wrapped up in theory and jargon. So the local context isn't often the only thing that's being highlighted. It's used as an exemplar to study a wider issues. And so, so representing what's happening on the ground to the academic community matters just as much as representing what's happening or your interpretations of it back to the community itself, because you're doing that balancing act of both being truthful to ground realities while at the same time ensuring that no further harm is enacted on anyone. But from scholars who have worked in authoritarian regimes, they have written for wider communities, both scholarly and policymaking. I think they would be in a better place to advise in terms of how they've navigated that tightrope, in terms of making sure that the work that they're doing can have some beneficial impact or insights without necessarily, putting anyone in danger. At the same time, I've seen scholars who have actually lent legitimacy to more ethno-nationalist fascism because that is the set of community they were studying, and there was only so much they could say. So it sounded like their work was being used as a rubber stamp. So I think it's incredibly challenging. But then there are people who actually speak truth to power, who will step out and say, no, this is wrong, or this is what was witnessed and it needs to be told. They might not be allowed back in the same space again, but in many ways, sometimes that kind of information needs to get out. And if the academic is the person who has, again, that privilege and opportunity to elevate those issues and write about it without direct threat to their livelihood or their personhood or their family, then in these cases, we've seen people take those risks. But we've also seen people who've taken risks from within. When you think about Gramsci's, prison notebooks, his most famous writing by Antonio Gramsci were written when he was imprisoned. So when we think about inspirational scholars, they're writing against fascist regimes from within. So I don't think we need to think about that we're the only or first or the unique in any way. I think there are a lot of sources in history that we can draw inspiration and teachings from.
Thank you, Professor Sultana. I'm actually happy that we're now discussing the reflexivity of the researcher and academic subjecthood while studying very pertinent and urgent crises like the global South cities and the devastation of climate change. I wanted to draw a note from your talk about politicizing climate change interventions, rather not depoliticizing, and not falling into the pitfalls of technomanagerialism as these typically tend to do. What I Quebec universities, as we are situated here, and Montreal especially, has a vibrant university working group culture that cuts across the university system here, which I'm very happy and proud to be part of. And while I participate as much as I can and contribute where it's possible, I have also come off feeling underwhelmed with the engagement, especially given that we are all, probably working out of faculties of arts and science, hosting social science departments as they are. So even sort of working committees that are set up for the express purpose of talking about climate change, I feel fail to address or bring up conversation that pertains to community engagements, where conversations on carbon credits or tax measures take precedence over relations with the community as, say, fossil fuel plants are expanded or new energy projects are announced, etc. While it's so surprising because most of the corporate companies that are involved in these have community engagement and community relations teams, and machinery, a whole machinery that backs it up. And that's just the North American context. I can speak of it in similar terms from the South Asian context in India as well, where academics fail to understand, to embed themselves in the community while they speak about politicizing climate action. The community is already interacting with the company more than they ever will with a stray few academics. So my question really then is, how can we develop a pedagogy of social sciences that can be transplanted from these global South contexts that we want to study here in this room at least, especially the South Asian context as we spoke about today? How can we develop a pedagogy that is applicable not just to, say, cross South Asia boundaries, but also to the global North? The similar crisis exists here in terms of land and community relations in North America. So I just thought I just wanted to flag this as a possible discussion point.
All right. Yeah, so that's a complex set of issues, right? Because context matters and different places have different histories of interaction, engagement, the role of the local state, the city-state, the city planners, but then also the federal government, and then histories of interactions between the private sector and the local community. So when we think about the ways that, I guess your question was developing, you said a pedagogy of engagement, right? That works. I think some of the issues that I mentioned might be relevant, I'd like to think, just because when we think about engagement, yes, you're right. Maybe different communities will end up, engaging with the corporate sector that's already moved in, or with a particular governmental body that's already highly present, and they may not care so much about engaging the academic. Well, the academic then needs to engage with everybody else. It is not just the community at the receiving end. The community is also the government agencies and the bureaucrats and the planners and the funders, the nonprofits or the NGOs, the other academics on the ground, the activists, right? The local politicians, the trade unionists. There's so many different groups to learn from and engage with, and then figure out what are the ways that it makes most sense in this context. Who do I need to speak with, and what do I learn from each space? So I don't know if we can create just one set of pedagogies. We can create sets of skills that we need to learn, right? Sets of tools. What does research ethics means? What is, deep participant observation? So these kinds of methodologies and methods that we do in the social sciences, or for instance, maybe it's aerial photography or GIS planning or storytelling or counter mapping, right? There are all kinds of different methodological skills that we can train on. But at the same time, I think there's also humanistic skills about, how to do the research that requires that deep listening, to decenter oneself, to decolonize one's mind, to keep that open-mindedness, to be willing to say, yes, this is a failed attempt, but that failure in itself is telling, is the outcome, and that needs a narration too. And then, there's also like archival work and other kinds of policy documentation, how to read and interpret different types of documents. So these are skill sets that we can incorporate into pedagogy, while we're also thinking about the wider kind of epistemological issues that need to be learned. And they do apply both in the global South and the global North, but I think they're slightly different in terms of access in different places, in terms of knowing colonial history and then post-colonial, what does nation building politics look like? It'll be different in the Canadian or the US context, right? It's unless you're doing work on Indigenous issues and internal colonization, more people are likely to just pretend this was always a free capitalist society and forget its settler colonial roots and current realities. And at the same time, that kind of geopolitical hegemonic role, it tends to be much more, well, what does this city need? And I'm only looking at this particular issue without looking at that issue around scale, space, and issues around that historicity that's necessary. So I think maybe what I'm saying is that we need better, more geographical education in terms of training methodologically and theoretically, because I think a lot of our students, my students certainly are, encouraged to learn this way, and they are trained in these certain ways so that they are able to take that training and that skill set and apply it in different contexts and then adapt to what more is necessary based on where they are. So I hope that answered the question. I'm not entirely sure if that did a good enough job or not.
Right. No, thank you so much for that. Yeah, we are at 1.
Sorry. We have one question in chat, or anyone has here any question, which are we good? You do? Okay. So what should we do? We can keep the question.
Okay.
All right. The question, okay, are we taking? I'm taking this question first and then we'll come to you. Yeah. So the question is from Amina Tarannum. Hello, I'm from Bangladesh. So I was wondering, what is the government's current strategy to battle waterlogged horrible conditions that arise during monsoon? Ongoing city development work has been blamed for the waterlogging in Dhaka. Is there any problem-solving effort on that, if you know of any? Thank you.
All right, thank you for that question. So every year, for years and years, right, the city developmental work is always blamed because and that speaks to that lack of coordination of, the continual digging up of roads to lay this pipe or this wiring or redo this sewage. So some of that is necessary because of infrastructural upgrades that are needed or repair work. But it is not only that. Some of it is absolutely about the way the city developed in a certain way that was not necessarily planned. The planned city was perhaps the parts of the colonial city, which were, not made for many, many cars and such a high population. Or even the pre-colonial, the Mughal city, which was the smaller walled city. Then you have the colonial city, which came with, the cantonment, the army barracks, those are much more spatialized. Then you have the more post-colonial, the post-independent cities, which then, that morphology then changed again. It expanded. You had wider roads, higher buildings, concepts, architects and urban planners brought in various local and international knowledge to try to grapple, but the city already had its roots. This is not a city that you just had a blank slate to work on. So there's layers. The city is actually multi-layered and multi-spatial. But in terms of that waterlogging, that is because of that morphology, in terms of that increasing concretization, that loss of water bodies to absorb rainwater for retention purposes and replenishing the groundwater. So lakes are disappearing. Some lakes are excavated. Some have disappeared and been built over. I mean, the city expands by, kind of concretizing over wetlands. So any city, even Houston in the US, any city that is concretized in a wetland, in a spongy, marshy area, will be prone to flooding. It's just the nature of the situation because concrete is impervious. Even if you have the new types of building material that lets water drain, that's not what we have right now on the ground. So there is, yes, works, the city works, like they keep calling it roadworks projects that do cause problems of local, tarmac being removed, everything gets muddy, then things are being laid, unlaid, re-tarmacked, and then removed again. So you have this kind of a little kind of frenetic energy in the city of various forms of crises and inaccess, of immobility. But then you also have the very much the political social substructure on top in terms of how the city was allowed to develop, or the different power relations and politics and power grabs and land grabs and water grabs that came with it. As a result, the city just does not drain. It doesn't have the infrastructure. And under the city, when they're laying bigger and bigger pipes, people are elevating roads, people are elevating buildings. But what does that mean? And this is where I guess Marxist theory of marginal spaces comes in, because it is the poor who are in the swampy, low-lying spaces, and the poor who are going vertically up. The rich are going vertically up and the poor are not. So you're going to have that kind of stratification. But the waterlogging issue is something that's very sensitive to Dhaka planners. Every time I've talked to them, they're not happy if I use the word about flooding or waterlogging. They call it like a drainage pause, or what was the word? I can't remember, but it was just like a slower rate of drainage. But that, yes, they're doing everything they can. Sometimes they have to deploy pumps, which suck the water from the city and then, push it on to the local rivers or farming communities, that they try to drain the city dry, so that the roads are more functional. It doesn't impede the economy, school children going to school for exams, people getting to work, people getting to the hospital. It's a balancing act. And I would not, I'm amazed that we're able to do what we are able to do, but it is a place of, and this is not a secret, most of these megacities are sites of high amounts of corruption and, high Gini coefficient, meaning the very poor and the very rich. There's a huge wealth imbalance, huge power imbalance. But it's, some social justice endeavors, some NGOs have been working towards reducing that gap in terms of making, for instance, water sanitation access, educational access. But the issue about waterlogging during the monsoon is one that seems to be an annual event. And I don't know of one perfect solution that's going to address it, but there are efforts to put in wider, bigger, rounder drainage pipes to increase the city's physical infrastructure for drainage, and the pumps that pull the water out, and then maybe figure out a way to reduce car traffic, vehicular traffic. Although I don't see how that's going to happen, but they have been building elevated metro platforms instead of going, a subway system under the ground, because it is a floodplain, so it's better to go elevated. But again, we're in a subsidence zone and earthquakes do happen. So that's another challenging fear, that if there's weak infrastructure, then everything falls like a house of cards. So it's a balancing act to be in this active delta zone that's flood prone.
Do you have time for one more question, Professor?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk, especially for your careful attention to the spatial inequalities on the ground there and the severe climate injustice. And it strikes me that as people who are being pushed out of rural spaces because of climate change into this megacity, so they're climate refugees, internal climate refugees in a sense, and then being spatially segregated in an apartheid way into these swampy, flooded, vulnerable spaces. And at the same time having international borders that don't allow for other forms of escape or migration. And your methodological emphasis on deep listening and careful attention to voices of people in that situation. I'm wondering if you have, and following up on the last question, which was about the government's sort of solutions or responses to this, I'm wondering if you've heard from people on the ground about their ideas and responses or even survival strategies in the face of this terrible injustice.
Their responses to the planning or to the reality?
Waterlogged situation, I guess, and the water itself.
Yes. So that is something that I kind of wove in throughout my talk in terms of how am I able to tell this story? Part of it is having, lived there for a long time, but then also having worked there for a long time. So to know that these concerns are cross class. The wealthy have see it as a problem, but they navigate the space differently. The middle class will have same problem, but they'll have different sorts of hybrid ways of navigating the space, different access, different opportunities. It is the lower and lower middle class that bears the brunt of that waterlogging. And it is about how water and sewage mix and come into homes, and contamination of waterborne diseases, of diarrhea and cholera and all of that. Constant need to spend money in water purification tablets or boiling the water, which again increases your energy, costs, whether it's fuel wood or if you're using a gas burner. And then the time necessary to heal, for care work. Care work burdens go up. And then who does the care work? Who is ill? Who still has to perform a job? But the one of the biggest challenges is mobility in the city. How do you get around to jobs if you're holding on two jobs? If you don't earn and you're a day earner, if you don't go that day, you don't eat that day. So that means you have to wade through this water and expose yourself to that contamination, and then face at the other end that burden of being contaminated, right? Of cleanliness and hygiene and clean clothes, of laundry. Where do you do laundry? Where do you bathe? Drinking water access. So there's all kinds of multiple things collide, and they affect the poorer members of the city in much harsher ways. And this is not new. These have been written about and known for a very long time. So a lot of different efforts, you hear about voluntary philanthropic groups, saying we have to rush out more drinking water bottles, or we have to get something similar to, let's say, Gatorade. It's called Orsaline. Actually, this oral rehydration was invented in Bangladesh some 50 years ago. It's salt and sugar and water mixed. When you're dehydrated, when you have a lot of water loss because of diarrhea, dysentery, or a fever, and so on, you're going to have to replenish, the electrolytes in your body. So these kinds of issues of, you have food drives, you have clothing drives, but then you also have displacement of people who cannot live in those huts, or they've been flooded, or they've been evicted. That's another thing that I didn't mention, but in terms of, frequent drives of the city saying, well, this is public space, and they'll just raise, the small meager houses, the informal dwellings, because it's been designated to be something else, maybe a different building, maybe part of the metro system, maybe it was a green space. So this constant precarity of, insecure housing is one of the biggest concern. And then when the waterlogging happens, the day-to-day life gets compounded and becomes another layer of stress. And it is the hardest thing to witness and to live in, because you're seeing children suffer, children become very ill, but at the same time, you see incredible communal sharing and solidarity, and people will share what they have. They will share water, they will share medicine. There's free health clinics. You do see people trying, from the upper classes, mobilizing to do it, but then you see sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And as the city gets more crowded, and as this more kind of hyper-consumption lifestyle becomes something that becomes aspirational, and as this kind of rampant individualistic, capitalistic attitude of lifestyle that very Western form of lifestyle is appropriate. I think those communal systems are breaking down, or rather they're being restitched in different ways. So, you had various patron-client relationships. Maybe you're from that community and there's a wealthy person who has been, or their family's been there for generations, and they have been the person, the patron, who has historically, looked out for their poorer brethren in that neighborhood. But then when they move, they leave, they dry out, their children are abroad, or they don't care, right? So these kinds of ties get broken, but the new ones could come in. Sometimes they're more formal. They might come in through a charity organization that's both local and global. It may come through a nonprofit or a local NGO. It may come through a voluntary association. Students are getting involved, so that there's different kinds of care work that then come into play. So I think it is the local stories are vary, but it is one of having to adapt because you have to. It is one of survival strategy, of coping, of maintaining different networks of relationships, figuring out how to keep things dry. So it's again both material and symbolic and discursive and communal and relational. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That will be our last question. Thank you all for coming and for engaging with the talk. Thank you to the moderators for your contributions. And of course, thank you so much, Professor Sultana, for an incredibly interesting talk that delved into a very complex situation while highlighting this urgent need for a humanist perspective when it comes to research and scholarship. So thank you all. Our next talk will be on March 7th, and it will be by a PhD candidate from art history at Concordia, Varda Nisar, on the Museum Military Complex in Pakistan. Hope to see you then, but until then, I wish you all an excellent day. Thank you again, Professor Sultana.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for having me. And it was lovely meeting you all. Thank you so much. All right. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us to Fourth Space today for this conversation, and everyone online, of course, thank you for coming here. Also, we will be closing up the Zoom and the live stream, but just want to let you know this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel, and we just made a playlist specifically for the South Asia Studies series, so you can catch up on what you've missed. But anyway, join us for the next episode.